We're going to get started. My name is Ruben Hernandez Leon. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology. I'm also the director of the Center for Mexican Studies, and I like to welcome all of you to this event, and also thank the various co-sponsors and organizers, the people who have been involved organizing the event, and of course welcome our authors this afternoon, and of course thank them in advance for a very interesting and stimulating work that will, for quite some time, I think, will guide our discussion on Latino educational policy. So the format that we will follow this afternoon is that we will actually have the authors first, and then we will proceed with the critique, which is my comments. So it's first you, Patricia, and then Francis, and then I'll move ahead with my commentary. So.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to try and really speak up here. Let me know if you don't hear, okay? And I think what I'll do is I'll try and sort of move away from the podium a little bit. And the first thing is I just really have to thank Kathy Rivera, John, and Chicano Studies Center here, because they've just done an amazing job of getting the word out and setting this up for us, and I just am really, really deeply appreciative. And I'm deeply appreciative of all of you who took your time to come here. You know, it feels very nice to have such a lovely audience. And I'm just going to embarrass somebody a little bit probably, but I just have to do this because many of you are graduate students. And I was a graduate student many years ago here at UCLA. And I had a couple friends, more than a couple, but these in particular, Nicandro Juarez and Betty Juarez, who had a consulting firm here in Los Angeles. And as a graduate student, Nicandro came to me one day and he says, you know, Patricia, there's this really interesting RFP out there to do a study of bilingual Head Start. It's never been done before. You want to help write a proposal? So, gee, I'm a graduate student. What do I know about this stuff? So I went and got my friend Luis Moll, and we sat down with Nicandro and we wrote a proposal. And this is the 1970s, you guys. We won this proposal for over $1 million. And we were so shocked. It was like, how could this happen? And how are we going to do this? And so Betty, I haven't seen Nicandro and Betty for decades. And it's just so very nice to see you here. And it just reminds me of these amazing experiences as a graduate student. So thank you for being here, and thank you for all those wonderful experiences. Okay. We're going to actually, the format here is Francis and I are going to be kind of quickly just give a few comments about the book, and the really important thing here is to hear from Ruben as he reflects on it, on the book, and he gives us a critique. So what I wanted to start with was what motivated this book. And for me, I think Francis may have a somewhat different answer. I haven't asked her, but for me, what motivated this book is two things. In the first chapter, you will see statistics in there that show that over the last 3 decades, Latinos have basically made no progress at all in gaining college degrees. In that meantime, for the last 3 decades, every other group has been increasing their performance in terms of college degree, and Latinos have wavered between 9 and 11% of the students young people in 25 to 29-year-old age group, and we have made virtually no progress. When you think about what has been happening in this economy and what has been happening with every other group in this economy, this is, I think, the definition of a crisis. And it's a crisis not just for this group of people, it's a crisis for all of us. Because when half of the students in California and half of the students in Texas are Latinos, and they are not getting to college and they are not completing degrees, they are not going to be viable in this labor market. And so that is the first thing that just absolutely shocks me every time I look at it, and that drove me. The second thing that motivated me personally was I've spent most of my career studying Latino achievement, and when it goes right, when it doesn't, what are the problems, what are the solutions. In one study that we did about 10 years ago, we started about 10 years ago, I met a young man who I call Andres. There's a whole story of Andres in this book, so I'm not going to go into all the details. What's important for you to know is that Andres was an extremely high-performing student. Andres challenged himself. He was a bilingual kid. He came from a family of 5. His stepfather was an undocumented European. You don't expect to hear that. Who had trouble getting work. And but Andres had knocked himself out as a student, and he had like a 3.9 in rigorous coursework. When I first met him, he was in the 9th grade, and at that time, you know, I followed him for some time, and somewhere around 10th or 11th grade, I said, Andres, don't make a move after high school, for plans after high school without talking to me. Because I knew if I had to pay for his tuition myself, I was going to do it, but I knew this kid would get scholarships to the Ivy League. Andres did not go to college. And the story is in the book, and it was the second thing made me say, how do we explain this? How do we talk about this? How do we create policies that lead to that never happening again? So the book, The Latino Education Crisis, in my mind, the subtitle is in many ways more important than the title. The subtitle is The Consequences of Failed Social Policy. That this is not just about a group that is not making it in this society. It's about a group that has not been helped to make it in this society, and that in fact has had impediment after impediment after impediment placed in front of it. So what we do in the book is there's an introduction that was added at the end because I had reviewers who wanted me to answer 3 things. One of them was, so who are Latinos anyway? And that does that. And isn't this just about immigration? I mean, isn't the crisis with this group, as soon as immigration abates, this will be fine and they will move on like every other group has? And that's answered in that introduction. And oh yeah, and then finally, you know, is this really a crisis? You know, is this hyperbole or is this really a crisis? And so I attempt to, we attempt to address that. In chapter 1, we lay out the political context for what is going on with this population. In chapter 2, we lay out the social context. The fact that according to international statistics, 37% of Latino children are living in poverty in this country, 37%. We have a greater percentage of young people in poverty in this country than any other wealthy nation in the world. And they are disproportionately African American and Latino kids. In chapter 3, we lay out the schooling context. What happens in schools that lead these kids away from successful outcomes. In chapter 4, we ask the question, is language really the problem? Is this just about not being able to speak English? In chapter 5 is case studies of these young people who we followed from the time they started high school until several years after high school, what happens to them and why. That tries to make real what the circumstances are for kids even like Andres, who on paper look like they're headed straight for the Ivy League. In chapter 6, we talk about, and I know Francis is going to say more about this in particular, about those kids who do make it. What do those kids look like, and how is it that they get there? Chapter 7 looks at the kinds of interventions that we know have had an impact and what it actually costs to do those, because we have to start talking. I mean, I think it's very appropriate for today when we have a budget deadlock because we cannot get 6 people from one party to vote to raise any taxes for anything in this state. It costs money to create a decent society. And so we try to lay out what it costs to create a decent society. And then finally, in the last chapter was written very much with the Obama administration in mind. We lay out 7 things that we must begin to do right now. if we are going to turn around the really grave situation that we have. And those deal with health care, preschool, housing desegregation, recruitment of competent, qualified teachers who can actually talk to the families and the children whom they educate, immigration reform and a DREAM Act as the very first piece of that, dual language education, and dropout prevention and college access programs to make it more possible for more students. So that's my really quick overview. Thank you.
Hi. It's great to be back home. I grew up in Norwalk. Do people know where Norwalk is? Yeah. So yeah, everyone should know where Norwalk is, 105 off the LAX, yes. So I feel like I'm back at home, and any time I get the chance to actually come back to the sun from Seattle, I jump on it. But I had two primary motivational factors for working on this book. The first is working with Patricia. She really is a faculty member and mentor that really does walk the talk. She's trained literally, I don't know, close to 50, if not close to 100 of the next generation of Latino scholars in this nation, and so it really has been a privilege to work on this project with her, a project that not only she is passionate about, but I'm passionate about as well. And then my second motivational factor is primarily more personal. I was one of those high achievers in the book. Many of you are students, you are the students that we write about, right? In the book about kids that are beating the odds. I was told by my high school counselor after, had a 4.0 GPA, I was involved, I was in every activity you could imagine, played the violin. So I looked like that stereotypical nerd that we described in the book, and I was told to go to a community college from my high school counselor. The same message 25 years earlier my parents had been given when they were in high school. And as we went out into the field and interviewed high achievers in different contexts, different regions of the country, we found that the same story was occurring regardless of the generation. And that largely attributes to the data that we see with this stagnant line of progress. So those are my two primary motivational factors, that we have to change the course. Because we're going to be the majority population within the next 30 years, we have no excuse to continue on this path, and it's going to be a collective effort from the Latino community with the policy community to change the course of Latino students. The chapters I want to highlight are just a few, because we really do want to hear from David and get to the reception. But I wanted to highlight one of the chapters. Ruben, sorry, Ruben. We talk about the social context for education. And in terms of the social context, we frame all of the forces and factors that contribute to achievement for Latino students. But the chapter I want to focus on is more related to the school context, and that is, and we don't want to give you all the answers because we want you to read the book, but we also want to just give you a framework, and the school context is largely related to the experience that I just described, and that is, we know that Latino students attend schools that are poorly resourced, that they have limited access to quality teachers, and that an injustice is occurring in schools today. I just conducted a study this fall in Washington on opportunities to learn for Latino students. Washington's a state that's about 20 years behind California in terms of population growth. What I found was just this incredible level of discrimination, as well as a lack of understanding of the needs of Latino students. And that was in every school district. We visited 14 school districts, and that was a pervasive message that we had found. The second chapter I want to highlight is chapter 7, and that's where we talk about the cost of intervention. We really wanted to document what would it cost to intervene, what would it cost to change the course, what are some programs that are actually getting it right. And what we found is there's some great programs out there. There's Head Start. We know that Head Start has a proven track record with communities in raising student achievement. We looked at Project Grad, we looked at Puente. Do people know what Puente is? It's one of the, so people know here in California, it's a mentorship program, but it also started in the community colleges, and now it's in high school and college. We looked at Success for All, reform efforts and programs. And what we found is that many of these programs, one, are operating on a shoestring budget. They're always constantly threatened when it comes to budget eras of retrenchment. And the second thing we found is that as soon as the intervention goes away, so do the effects of the programs. And so we really need systemic answers to raising Latino student achievement and success to keep these kids in school. And then in the final chapter I want to highlight is the piece that really gives us hope. And that is a lot of students, and the stories of a lot of you and students in this room. And that is the chapter on kids that are beating the odds. We looked at a few data sources, one of which was the SAT data sample. And we looked at high achievers and what it is that these kids are doing, based on their quantitative profiles, complemented by qualitative research and interviews. And what we found, and I'm glad my parents are here today with me, my father Gil and my mom Celia, their messages kind of rang true when I was doing some of this research, and that is, my dad used to tell us that a busy kid is a good kid. I'm going to keep you guys busy. I'm going to keep you involved because I don't want you involved in games, because there was this bad section of Norwalk that he was concerned about. And that's what he did. He made sure that whatever we were interested in, he provided those opportunities for my siblings and myself. We found that the Latino high achievers in the book were very much the same. They made the best of what they had access to. They were involved in an honors program. Even if they had access to 1 or 2 AP classes, they were in those AP classes. Many of them had been involved in the band. They were involved in extracurricular activities like an ethnic activity that would look differently from their white peers. They were involved in their church. They worked. Many of them worked. They were far more likely to work than any other group with the exception of African Americans. And they were involved in student government. So these are kids that really did see that there was a pathway and they were hopeful about their future. And what we found is that being involved in these extracurricular activities mattered. It mattered with respect to not only SAT math scores, but it also mattered in terms of their GPA. And we know that these are factors that are taken into consideration for college admission. So the challenge that we outline in the book is, yes, we know that there are these profiles of students that make it. Our challenge is to make sure that there are opportunities to learn so that more students can fit those profiles and have access to those opportunities. And with that, I'll follow. Thank you.
I'll follow in the footsteps of the authors and approach the audience, try to project my voice and see if it works. I forgot to mention that after authors and Critic deliver their comments, we're going to have opportunity to exchange and have a session of questions and answers.
And a reception with food.
And a reception with food, most important. So I will actually depart from the wonderful pedagogical style of the authors, and actually will read my comments. The authors can talk about their book like nobody else can. So I actually prepared some written comments, and hopefully they will honor the content of the book and deliver some interesting, stimulating critique. I'll probably pick up a fight or two this afternoon. So since arriving at UCLA in 2002, I have attended a few graduation ceremonies of the Cesar Chavez Department on campus. It is always a very moving ceremony. Every time I have attended, each student is given the microphone for a few minutes. Most of them thank their parents while relating stories of hard work and sacrifice in the fields, factories, and garment sweatshops. Students also recall how intimidated they felt at UCLA, how cold the university seemed to them, and how challenging it was to survive and stay in college. A few more graduates wave their diplomas and angrily say things like, "This is for the stupid high school counselor who told me I wasn't UCLA material." And yet, despite how heartbreaking these anecdotes are, and make actually a lot of the faculty cry and a lot of the people in attendance cry, they are the stories of the young men and women who made it. They are the successful ones with a UCLA diploma in hand and who are most likely on the path to upward mobility. Sadly, these high-achieving individuals represent only a small fraction of all the Latinos who embark on their educational careers years before. The factors that explain the experiences of this high-achieving minority and of the underachieving majority of Latinos are analyzed in The Latino Education Crisis by Patricia Gandara and Francis Contreras. The authors begin by carefully outlining the critical situation of Latino educational achievement. A high percent of Latinos consistently display low levels of reading and math competency in the elementary school years, leading to a progressive disengagement from school, tracking, and lack of access to a variety of educational opportunities. Nearly 50% of Latinos who begin high school drop out at some point in their 4-year cycle, and only 11% of Latinos ages 25 to 29 have earned a bachelor's degree. And although the children of immigrants make substantial progress relative to the first generation, such progress is not nearly sufficient for Latinos to reach a middle-class socioeconomic status in a post-industrial United States. The negative consequences are not only for the group in question, which faces a lack of social and educational mobility, but also for the society at large. And this is actually a very important message in the book. Given that Latino students constitute a large segment of the school population and will be an even larger proportion of all U.S. students in the near future, 1 in every 4 students will be Latino by 2025, this pattern of underachievement in low high school and college graduation rates forecast a lifetime of low wages and therefore loss of tax revenues and loss of competitiveness in the global economy. A Mexican colleague reminded me that another byproduct of this situation is the expansion of inequality in this country, a trend that will make the United States resemble highly unequal societies such as Mexico and Brazil. There is a long list of factors that contribute to poor academic achievement, from lack of access to preschool programs, underfunded schools with their long list of problems, low levels of social and cultural capital among parents, lack of access to preparatory and advanced placement courses, unsafe neighborhoods, high residential mobility, low expectations on the part of teachers, residential segregation and linguistic isolation, and the dismantling of affirmative action and other programs that facilitate minorities' access to higher education. Still, no other factor is more important than the pervasive poverty experienced by Latino children and their families, a fact that the authors revisit numerous times throughout the book. Thus, in 2005, 28% of all Latino children lived in poverty, a statistic that probably underestimates the true level of Latino poverty existing in this country. Needless to say, many other risk factors derive from poverty. This book, The Latino Education Crisis, presents a decidedly realist portrait of the situation, but not a pessimistic one. As the authors show in the book and have commented today, the small proportions of Latinos who do make it to college already provide us with important clues about the variables that contribute to success: strong and consistent parental emotional support, availability of informal educational resources at home, linguistic ability, access to high-level coursework, access to diverse social networks via extracurricular activities, good schools, and a culture that reinforces at every turn high educational aspirations via peers and adults who can offer a positive influence on students. According to the authors, the solution to the current state of affairs requires a broad effort, centered on investment in educational resources and institutions from preschool to universities, investment in social services and communities, and seizing on the strengths of Latino children and families. In sum, this is an excellent and timely book which will guide our understanding of the Latino education crisis and the possible avenues to get out of it for a long time. Now on to the critique, since according to the announcement for this event, this is supposed to be an author's made critic, one critic session. I'll do my best, but needless to say, the authors have made my task quite difficult. I'll have to resort to my area of expertise, or my areas of expertise, which are international migration and Mexico. I have to start by saying that given that the presence of many of these children in US schools, given that it is the result of a cross-border social process, namely international migration, or what now some call transnational migration, I find surprising the absence of almost any reference to the trans-state dimensions of the phenomenon under study. Why is that? This is to the authors.
Taking notes.
Is this a bias of the researchers? Is this a reflection of the fact that in the end we're dealing with one of the most national, quote unquote, of all institutions, public schools? Or is it a tacit recognition that despite all the talk about transnationalism, the fortunes of the children of immigrants rest within the bounds of the receiving state, in this case, the US? I pose these questions based on several issues that I think shed light on the transnational or binational dimension of the educational experience of at least, or sizable proportion of Latinos in the US. First, we know, as a result of the studies by Victor Zúñiga, Ted Hammond, and others, Patricia and I'm sure Francis as well know these studies, that at least a fraction of the Latino student population, particularly Mexicans, is actually mobile across countries and across public school systems. What do we make of that? Second, even though working class immigrants from Mexico do not have the resources that Asian immigrants possess to invest in the after-school programs that populate Asian American communities and that appear to contribute to the success of Asian American students, Mexican immigrants are actually able to mobilize resources collectively towards a variety of goals. Most famous is the network of hometown associations and committees which invest not negligible amounts of money in development and beautification projects, as well as patron saint festivities in Mexico. And yet, HTAs are not well known for investing in educational programs for children of immigrants in the US. Let me bring up an example. Many of you know the documentary, The Fifth Section, La Quinta Sección, by filmmaker Alex Rivera. The film showcases the experience of a small HTA whose members are from Puebla, the state of Puebla in central Mexico, south central Mexico, and who managed to collect substantial amounts of money to invest back in the hometown. They do a bunch of different projects. The largest project, however, is a baseball stadium, which costs the committee $50,000. As shown in the documentary, ironically, as shown in the documentary, the small stadium back in Puebla remains idle most of the time because most of the likely players are already in the US. Why didn't the members of the HTA invest these resources in an after-school tutoring program for their children? In upstate New York, where the documentary takes place, these resources would have paid for several tutors for more than 1 year, according to my calculations. Several reasons explain why resources went elsewhere. Low levels of formal schooling, social and cultural capital prevent parents from realizing the significance, the value of such an investment. Another reason has to do with one basic fact related to the immigration experience. While the second generation's educational needs and solutions lie in the United States or within the United States, the first generation continues to be oriented towards the homeland and therefore continues to make investments over there. Although such orientation gradually shifts towards the new home with time and with the presence of children in the US, the homeland continues to exert a powerful draw. But other factors play a role as well. The instability associated with the uncertain legal status of many Latino immigrants and their families, and I think I don't need to say much more about that. At the same time, sending country governments have developed policies to attract resources back to the homeland via matching grant programs. The Mexican government, for example, matches every dollar invested by an HTA with $2, $3, and even $4 additional dollars. Naturally, these incentives apply to development projects implemented in Mexico, road construction, sewer, and potable water systems, not to investments made in the United States. It is not difficult to tap into the energies of the first generation and its network of HTAs to get them to transfer resources to, in this case, Mexico. Immigrants raise their status and power vis-a-vis stay-at-home individuals, local governments, and folks from neighboring towns. Perhaps this is just another way to argue that immigrant parents have a much more important role to play in finding solutions to the current crisis. I suspect that their empowerment will pass primarily through the empowerment of mothers, who are less interested in returning to Mexico, as we know from the literature on migration, than their husbands, and less interested in the often masculine world of HTAs and hometown-oriented activities. The issues I have raised here would suggest that external factors do matter in the educational opportunities of Latinos in the United States, some directly and some indirectly. Finally, in the form of a question, can the educational resources and infrastructure of sending countries such as Mexico play a role in improving the educational outcomes of the children of Mexican immigrants in the US? It's a question. In 2002, a group of colleagues and myself contributed a chapter to a book entitled Education in the New Latino Diaspora, in which we argued, based on an experience in Georgia, a binational educational project in which a Mexican university got involved with a public school system, assisting and providing a variety of services and developing a series of programs. We argued in that piece that Mexican universities can provide cultural know-how and academic and institutional legitimacy to school programs supporting Latinos in the US, while facilitating an interlocutory dialogue and playing the role of mediators between immigrants and local actors. I am aware that these ideas took shape in the context of a small-scale project, and that the issue of scale, when we talk about the Latino education crisis, puts limits on the viability of our suggestions. Still, the question stands. Is there a role for Mexico and Mexican institutions to play? The book is largely silent on this point. Needless to say, none of these observations and comments questions the central argument of the Latino education crisis and its findings. The book presents a dire diagnosis of the situation, but is also a hopeful call to action to change the outcome. Thank you. So, response from the authors, of course.
So can I go first? That's wonderful. Thank you, Ruben. The absence of a discussion of transnationalism and its implications. You're right, it's not there. It's not my expertise. And I didn't write about, and Francis chose not to write about, the areas that were not our expertise. And I want to invite you, Ruben, to co-author the next book with me, in which we actually address this issue. But there was a minor point here, and which was the reason that the introduction took shape. When this book is written for a national audience, and as I mentioned, the last chapter was written for the Obama administration. And one of the things that occurred when the book went out for review, before they actually publish and it goes out for review, is that we got hit kind of hard for being too Mexican. People on the East Coast, and it's published by Harvard University Press, so you can imagine that the reviewers were mostly East Coast, and I know a Midwest reviewer, and they said, well, wait a minute here. What about Dominicans and Puerto Ricans and Cubans and? So there's a part of me that says, at least I did not want to shape this too close to being a book about Mexicans and Mexican origin people, acknowledging that Latinos is a larger rubric. But the reality is, and you will see that in the introduction, that we have to come back to saying, more than 2/3 of the Latino population in the U.S. is Mexican origin. And this is the reality, and this is where most of this issue is occurring. And it certainly is not occurring for the most part amongst Cubans in Florida. This is not the problem. So that's a little bit of an excuse and also an admission. I'm going to let you say something about home tasks because I think you wanted to, right? So let me just, I felt like this was like one of these little powder puff blogs to me about can't Mexico have a role? We don't write about it in this book, but we are very invested in this notion of Mexico-U.S. partnerships. And in fact, we have a project going right now that is miraculously being funded by the Gates Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation, and a couple of the students who are here in the room are actually working on this project to try and get Mexico and the U.S. partnering on getting Spanish-speaking students successfully through an A through G college preparatory curriculum. And so Mexico is, in fact, the Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores and Instituto de Mexicanos en el Exterior are giving us money also to build a program where we can use Mexican curriculum to supplement the English curriculum here and help these kids get on their way and prepared for college. So we're on that one. Okay.
And I just want to address the issue of the hometown development associations. I thought that was it's an excellent point. And again, this is an admonition of us not focusing on the role of immigration. But I do think that one of the issues we did try to frame for the audience is not only the role of the social policy community, but we also discussed the role that the Latino community can play, right? With parents and Head Start and programs and activities and efforts that Latinos, parents and students can engage in to raise Latino achievement. So I think that the hometown development associations are a really good example of how to shift the thinking about investment. And I think you point to that dilemma beautifully. But I do want to say that, you know, in terms of the policy recommendations at the end, yes, we framed it for the Obama administration, but I think that there are some takeaways for the community and for you all in this room, because many of you are students and grad students. You're this next generation that will be implementing these changes to change the course of Latinos, is to see those recommendations as a partnership and not solely the responsibility of the government. We have to shift our thinking and take ownership of the plight of the Latino community to change the crisis that exists.
So, questions for the authors? Questions or comments? Yes, go ahead.
Latino is a big term and a big tent. Are there differentiations between various areas of Latino culture that are different in terms of their statistics in education? I mean, in a crude sense, do Puerto Ricans do better than Mexicans do? You know, or something?
We actually do address that in the book, and we go through statistics on various groups. I guess just to answer briefly, absolutely. We go from Cubans in Florida, who oftentimes outperform native-born white Americans, to Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, the two groups that perform very similarly to each other and that have many of the same kinds of issues. We also talk a little bit in the book, too, about the Mexicanization of other Latino groups. Because the Mexican population is so culturally dominant in many parts of the country, Salvadoreños, Guatemaltecos, Nicaraguenses get kind of scooped up under it. And you find these groups oftentimes displaying Mexican-type culture because it is so pervasive. But there are differences among the groups, and we do try to address that.
The questions? Yes.
I have a request that you would expand a little bit on the policy recommendations. I mean, for those of us who haven't yet had the pleasure of reading your book, it would be interesting to hear a little more about it. But I do have a question about gender. Ruben referred to the predominantly masculine context of the hometown associations, and I have two questions actually. One is about that, and also about the second generation. Alejandro Portes has referred to the second generation as a strategic research site, and has given a lot of reasons as to why the second generation of Latino immigrants is likely to perform differently or has performed differently from immigrant groups in the past, and how you think that is going to shape the policy recommendations that you are likely to submit if you do end up submitting them to the government, and how you think that's going to affect the way you frame your policy recommendations.
Do you want to talk about the gender?
So the question of gender with the hometown associations is with respect to it being
well, I know
masculine
that it is, but
yeah.
if you were talking a minute ago about hometown associations as being a locus of mobilization, if you will, if I understood what you was it you?
Yes, that was right.
I'm sorry.
So yeah, and and that's the interesting dilemma, because our women are pacing our men, right? In high school, in graduation rates, and in college attendance rates, and that's actually mirrors national trends of women outpacing men generally, but Latinas are doing much better than their Latino counterparts. So I think the interesting issue with the hometown associations is that if they, considering the fact that they are largely male dominant, and we also interviewed students that, if they're female, for example, from a rural setting, they're less likely to receive positive messages about college. So that's I think that has to be factored into the use of and how education occurs within these hometown development associations. Is that there needs to be education along gender lines in terms of empowering young immigrant women as well to be able to pursue their higher education. And that's something that we don't address, but we do address with respect to the hometown associations, but we do address this issue of women outpacing men and the patterns among Latinas and Latinos in all levels. So the high achievers as well as those that are most likely to slip through the cracks, that our women have a tremendous amount of resiliency in terms of making their way through the pipeline. There are also different experiences in the school context, and we address it in the school context chapter, and how our Latino men and women are treated differently in school.
Now, with respect to your other question, I guess that's a very, very big question, because there are very big debates that are going on out there among academics about the second and third generation, and whether Latino immigrants are going to follow the pattern of prior immigrants, or whether they're taking a different route. And we argue in the book for the latter, and largely because of a radically different economy in which these people are trying to integrate into, and also because of a very large and rapid increase in immigration. We are creating barrios. We are creating huge islands of isolation in which access to the job market, access to schooling, access even to the English language are barred by the isolation in which folks are living in. And so I am not optimistic that without some substantial interventions that this population is going to, in the second generation, is going to be able to follow a pattern that we've seen in the past. It's a complicated question.
Yes.
I'm not comfortable asking this question, but I don't want to be attacked with the question.
If you can raise your voice just a little bit.
Yeah, I will.
Because she doesn't want to be attacked. So.
It's not the most popular. I haven't read your book, but I did notice the title about society. And where I feel it is, I think one of the problems is that many of the Latinos who come here from Mexico are campesino families. It would be like taking rural from any other community. Normally, I think not as educated, not as professional, in anywhere. China too, okay? I happen to feel that a lot of it needs to be done in the Latino community because the parents don't speak English. The kids in immediately don't speak English when they're born into the families, they speak Spanish. And even though the language has no negative, you sort of mentioned it wasn't just language, but I think the basic is working within the community and letting them know that the opportunities are there, because society, it's worked for some other immigrant groups. So where does your book take a place in terms of putting the responsibility? I don't want, as a gringo, I don't want to take it all. Share the responsibility.
Ruben, I want you to respond to that, and then we can respond to it as well, if you're comfortable.
Thank you, Patricia. I mean, I think you're right about the fact that a lot of the immigrants are come from low socioeconomic backgrounds with limited formal schooling, social cultural capital, and I think that the book recognizes that. But I think that one of the things that happens here is sort of related to what Patricia was saying just a moment ago, is that over here that translates into a great deal of sort of social and economic and linguistic isolation for a lot of people. So in order to sort of break that, it's not going to be entirely possible by sort of kind of like people breaking out from within, precisely because these are sort of very strong structural circumstances that basically put a lid on a lot of individual, even familial energy. The book actually, I think, does a good job in emphasizing how significant it is for students and for the families to access a diverse, for example, a diverse set of social networks. Why is that? Well, we know well from studies of social networks that whenever people have a limited social network in size and in quality, they will continue to receive the same information, ultimately redundant information. They will not find out about opportunities elsewhere. They will not have access to linguistic resources. And this happens with the parents, but also happens with the children. This is what is so interesting. Children do not necessarily immediately find out about opportunities that they have in the schools where they are actually studying. So I think that the book, I think, does a good job in terms of framing what the challenges are. And in my intervention, I actually tried to do something along the lines of your commentary, that in fact there is work to be done within Mexican, Puerto Rican, Latino communities across the United States in partnership with non-governmental organizations, with foundations, with a variety of community-based organizations to sort of break that linguistic isolation. The government, of course, will always play a very important role here, partly because of our experience of segregation and discrimination that can at times only be broken with legal mandates. And on the other hand, the resources, right? The resources that are necessary to actually put in place sort of viable programs and strategies that can actually break that isolation.
I'd like to challenge the premise of your question a bit, and that's, you're not being attacked, but I want to challenge the premise of your question with respect to language. It's a common, a lot of misinformation occurs around the use of language and the benefits of language for children. We're one of the few developed nations where children only learn to speak one language, where we push for a monolingual society. So with respect to the issue of language, our children are being given messages that it's a bad thing to learn two languages, to speak two languages, and our schools haven't been able to respond to the level of bilingualism that is a benefit to the child, to society, to their ability to interact with a global economy later on. So I think what we have to do is really rethink how we're discussing language and issues about language, and start to see it as a benefit and not an impediment to learning. Countless studies have been done, and I'm sitting here next to an expert, but countless studies have been done on the benefits of bilingualism and the ability of students who speak two languages to do in schools. The work of Kenji Okuda, the work of Patricia, several call it Russell Rumberger. So what we talk about in the book is that we need to focus on capitalizing on the strengths of speaking multiple languages and the strengths of immigrant communities, and not see those characteristics as a deficit. I think that's one of the key challenges for schools, that we haven't done a good job perceiving students when they come to the door and the strengths that they have from their home environment.
Thank you, Francis. I'll just add a couple lines to that, and that is that the subtitle of this book is The Consequences of Failed Social Policies. And I would argue that these aren't things that just happen. These are things that happen because we have certain policies in place that keep other things from happening. And we have in this country instituted quite a number of policies that hobble these students, and only one of them being now this massive anti-bilingual kind of thing, so that students can't get access to the curriculum until their English is good enough, and they live in isolated communities where they're not getting English, and it's a vicious cycle. We've had the assaults on affirmative action, we have assaults on immigrants. Many of our kids, most of these kids in the schools are born here, they're our own citizens. We are responsible for them. But many have at least one parent that is born outside the country. And this assault on immigrants bears heavily on these kids in the schools. They're afraid. And it's very hard to go out and integrate yourself into a society that you know has the whole series of policies set up to discover you and get you out of there. So it's not to say that there is not a responsibility in the community to do what the community can, but the community needs partners with the society. And I think we argue that the policies that have been driving the integration of immigrants in this country have been very negative policies.
Other questions? Yes, please.
I was wondering if does your book addresses the issues that adult students, maybe the students that have been forgotten, that they maybe want to return back to school. Do you address some of those issues? And I guess the second question is, do they deserve a second opportunity? I'm asking you, acknowledging how important the youth are also, but just, so do you address some of those issues as well?
No, we don't, and it's something that is not in this book, and you're absolutely right that it is a very, very important issue. You know, any book is going to sort of draw the line somewhere and say, I'm going to deal with this and I'm not going to deal with those things. But that is not to say that the issue that you raise is not terribly important, because it is. And you ask, do they deserve a second chance? You know, I don't think that's the way I would put it. I think I would put it, is it in our best interest to give them a second chance? And the answer to that is clearly yes.
Yes? Yes?
I have a question. So, this is like from more like a grassroots level, because I work at a nonprofit organization that tries to build collaborations with different schools to offer different resources. And it's not in terms of tutoring, but offering, like what you were saying, this kind of enrichment activities, extracurricular activities, to think about social issues. And I'm just wondering if you ran across it in your research and just doing, writing the book. But one of the issues that I have is really hitting up against administration that's very resistant to working with community-based organizations, and who are very resistant to letting in just different resources that would, you know, benefit their students. And kind of similar to what you were saying just now, just in terms of policy, or them having really strict policies, and so just putting different hoops before you can even enter the school. And so I don't know, I'm just wondering if your book speaks to that, or just maybe different instances.
Well, with respect to the intervention programs, the chapter on intervention programs, we do talk about and question whether, you know, the degree to which some of these intervention programs already take the top. In other words, do they focus on the kids that would have already made it? Creaming and identifying high achievers to make their program look good, to show that they have outcomes. And that's a common problem across nonprofit intervention programs and education programs. It's even more true for minority student programs, for student of color programs. So yes, we didn't address the issue with respect to with intervention programs and their relationship and running up against a wall with administration. We talked about the issue of partnerships, and those programs that appeared to be the most successful actually partnered with the school and complemented the efforts of the school. So they weren't happening in isolation. So Success for All, Project Grad, that was actually engaged with the school and with the teachers, had the most promising effects in terms of being able to influence the curriculum that students had access to. So with that respect, we did some of that. Does that answer your question? I know. Okay. I'll be happy to talk to you after too.
Other questions? Yes, Otto.
It might be a difficult institution to deal with, but do you talk about within our community, church and other sorts of association, institutional power, that we deal with institutional power, with a lot of outreach, with the captive audience, including first and second generations. How do you see that institution participating in this reconfiguration and dealing with the crisis?
Although that's a really, and I think Francis and I share very similar feelings about this, because I think that we've both had those kinds of relationships that have influenced us. I think probably the way we deal with it most is in some of the interviews and the stories of individuals, how that has made a difference for them. And so simply pointing out that this is another resource out there, but we don't come too close to saying how it is that we recommend or we think that that resource should be used. But I agree with you. It's a really widely untapped resource in communities of color.
Well, one of the places I think where we probably address it is this social context for education, because we talk about the social supports in the social context for education chapter. We talk about the social and community supports that exist, these influences, and they could be from peers or role models. Stanton Salazar and Stephanie Espina, Ricardo Stanton Salazar and Stephanie Espina talk about these fortuitous relationships that occur with these social organizations. So in that way, we frame it, and it's largely framed with this social context for education, and the church is one of them. And then later we revisit it because church, and being involved in a church-related activity, Latino students are more likely to elect to participate in church-related activities than their white peers. So that was an interesting finding for us, that they were more likely to actually be engaged with the church than perhaps their peers that they were going to school with.
I just want to throw that out that in my wife's work, she's had to reach out sort of desperation to deal with the African American community and pastors and both parishes and Protestant churches, and the ministers there are excited to actually tact to help, because they see the children, they know the families. That's what people pray for all the time.
I personally feel very strongly about this as well, that this is just a totally untapped area, and maybe we can do another book on that one.
Thank you for your book and the discussion it's engendering. Two things. One, I want to share an impression that you may validate or correct. And the other is to ask a question from my reading of reaction to your book. One impression I have is to do with the attitude toward education, particularly with my impression about the Latino immigrant community is that its attitude about education is different from perhaps the nationwide attitude that an education is key to success. I'll be interested to know if you know, like, what are the attitudes in the home countries as far as education? How much of children do make it up to graduate or undergraduate education?
as well. We have an economy that is highly structured along the lines of formal education to break in. That's not necessarily quite the situation in other places, but I think it would be very difficult for us to go country by country and sending country to know. I'm sure there's a lot of variation. The cooperative versus competitive structures in the classroom. You know, I've always been very nervous about any kind of stereotype that this group is more cooperative and that group is more competitive, or this group is, you know, so my reading of the research is that the cooperative kinds of ways for children to learn are good for kids. It's good for teaching kids how to collaborate. It's good for teaching kids how to problem solve in a real societal context, and that it's a good in itself. Whether or not Latinos are more cooperative or more competitive, I think the research is really kind of the jury's out on that. But I do think that there is good evidence that cooperative kinds of learning structures are simply better for kids and preparing them for society.
Yes.
Yes, I have a question. Regarding the policy. Yes, my question is, the first part of the question is, whether programs such as the No Child Left Behind Act has been implemented in recent years, whether that has been helpful at all to help students, or whether putting money is the solution to the problem. And if so, what other programs are there available to help? And my other part is whether the DREAM Act that helps undocumented students to gain legal status and more integration into American society, will that help or empower school districts in order to help them adapt to American society?
We actually, that's great question. I'm going to tackle the latter part, because the first part you're going to have to refresh me on. We actually do recommend a National DREAM Act in the book, and yes, obviously we're concerned about undocumented, immigrant students, undocumented Latinos not being able to fully access and reach their potential by pursuing a higher education. So that's very much top 3 or 4 on our list in terms of promoting opportunities. And we make the case that these are students that have come to this country through no fault of their own and really do see the United States as their home. And so we shouldn't penalize them. In fact, these are a select group of high-achieving kids that will turn around and become leaders in their community. So it doesn't make any sense not to invest in these students. The first part of your question, I'm sorry, can
NCLB
NCLB, yes. With respect to high-stakes testing and high-stakes accountability, I think throughout, with respect to the school context for education, that would probably be where the chapter you'd find where we critique the accountability framework that has been implemented under the Bush administration with respect to, thinking about how we measure student progress, but also using accountability frameworks punitively. We really need to shift the paradigm, and there's an opportunity with this new administration to actually shift how assessment is used. So by no means do we say assessment isn't important, because we are proponents of assessment, but we do critique aspects of assessment that are punitive, such as high-stakes tests, exit exams, that haven't really served any student well across ethnic groups in the country.
And I'll add to this because it's an issue that I've been involved in for a couple decades, actually. And the reason that we argue that this is not a fair, well, there's multiple reasons why we argue that it's not a fair system that's been set up, but let me just point to a couple. For quite some time, there has been a quiet debate, not a loud one, but a quiet debate about shouldn't any system of high-stakes testing include embedded in it opportunity to learn? Is it fair to test kids on whether they know something that they may have never been exposed to because they're in schools that don't even provide that kind of education or who don't have teachers that are prepared to deliver it? I say it's a quiet conversation because people get very nervous when you raise it. They start thinking lawsuits, money, all kinds of things. But we believe it's a critical conversation. And I think there is some legal basis, to believe that this is a critical conversation. So opportunity to learn is really, I think, at the center of this. But there's another thing that I personally have been very involved in over the last 3 years or so, And that's a case that is going on in California, which we have hoped would be a banner case for the nation. That's Coachella versus the state of California. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice because I'm trying to talk very loud. And that's where 9 school districts in this state sued the state and said, this makes no sense that you are testing us with tests that our kids don't understand. And then you were telling us that our kids don't know these things, but we don't know that because you can't possibly know these things on the basis of tests that our kids don't understand. There is in NCLB really lovely language that says you should never do this. And yet the federal government under the prior administration has not enforced that in any place. And so within California, we have been trying to get some attention paid to the fact that there's no enforcement on these kinds of policies.
Okay, you say that.
Just a second. The back, there was another person there, yes? Go ahead. Can you stand and raise your voice, please?
When you refer to students who are beating the odds, and I'm assuming those are those who have the raw score, a good raw score of GPA and SAT math. Do you also include the students who do fairly average but have the qualitative factors, but then do well in the university? And
We don't measure the students at the university, but that's a good question. The Beating the Odds chapter is a mixed methods chapter. So the SAT sample is just part of that chapter, and no, we don't have a cutoff score for looking at the effects for the entire sample, but in part of the analysis, we look at the top quintile. So those that are in the top quintile, we look at their patterns.
For their own group.
For their own group. So the top quintile within the Latino group, the top quintile within the white group, so the top score, to understand the difference between those highest achieving and those that are in the aggregate group. So we did do some of that, but we complemented the data with qualitative interviews of students that are already in college, so yes, that are beating the odds, that maybe they didn't have the high SAT score. So we wanted to capture beyond raw score cutoff of the top quintile, but in using the aggregate data, we solved that issue as well.
We have one more in the back, I think. Was there somebody else in the back? No?
Right here, she's been trying to. Oh,
It's okay? Emil, and then we'll go to you. Yes, go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Emil Loy. I really enjoyed the talk. Thank you very much. I was very interested.
Higher voice.
Okay, higher voice. Not just that. I was very interested in your point of extracurricular activities that when kids are involved, they perform better. And the extracurricular activity that caught my attention, and mostly because it's related to my own research interest, is that when they work, they do better. I do research with children that are street vendors, and there's a stigma associated with work, specifically in my research because it's informal, it's illegal to street vend in LA, and it's very associated with being Mexican and that work. So I'm wondering what kind of work are these kids doing? Are they working with their parents? Are they working at McDonald's? Is it mostly work in school? And I'm just wondering if you ask those types of questions.
Yeah, in the interviews we did actually, we asked, you know, how long they've worked, and I did a case study in Washington, and so what I found, I was at Research One in Washington doing the case study, and what I found is that a lot of the students actually worked through high school with their parents in the field, so they were picking cherries, picking apples. A lot of the Latino population that comes to the university are from a rural setting, so the dynamics are slightly different in the state of Washington. But I found that they did a number of activities. Some of them cleaned homes and cleaned offices with their parents at night. They worked over 20 to 25 hours a week, and that was one of the findings that we were like, if they're working so much, how can they, you know, how are they doing so well? But they're really disciplined. And so what we found was that coupled with the work, you know, and the work ethic that comes along with having to maintain a job, they actually were really highly organized and being able to kind of compartmentalize work and school and complete those tasks. So that stemmed from our interview experience. From the SAT data, we couldn't tell that it was whether or not they worked or not and the degree to which they worked, but it was really in the qualitative data that some of this was borne out.
You know, I'm looking around the room because is Veronica still here? Kadikis?
No, I think she just left.
She was here earlier because she's been working with Paul Ong in sociology looking at this issue too. And they just did a really interesting chapter in this book on multiple pathways. Okay, great. Yeah, okay. It's a fascinating chapter because contrary to what most people would think, students of color are less likely to work than white students. And why is that? Because the jobs and the transportation to get to the jobs, all of that, are more available for these middle class kids. And then in fact, up to a certain point, 15 hours a week or so, it actually does correlate with higher grades. So as long as they're not, you know, working too long, it's a good opportunity to learn a lot of skills and become integrated in the society. But that opportunity is not available to many students of color in isolated poor communities.
And documentation status also affects that, the type of work that they would do.
Okay, thank you.
The second, just for me, like the question that I was going to ask about, I know that a lot of people are pointing to expanded learning time or longer school days as a possible way to improve educational achievement for minority students that are going to schools like kids schools that have longer days. And I'm wondering if that's a strategy that you approve of, or is that just going to be at odds with the work and all of the extracurricular activities that you say that Latino students are actually heavily involved in?
Liz, I think we come down very strongly on the side that there has to be extra time because these kids have extra tasks. And it just cannot all happen in the same amount of time and expect them to catch up with other kids. So there has to be extra time. I'm not, however, selling KIP. And I think we need to think creatively about that. And also with respect to the extracurriculars, we talk about making extracurricular curricular because it is so, these things are so important for kids, and yet many kids coming from low-income circumstances cannot access those things because of cost, because they're after school, they've got to take the bus home, they don't have any transportation, or because they're helping out at home doing baking, for a host of reasons. And also, actually, it's important to say because many of them feel like they don't belong, like they're not really accepted, and so why in the world would I try out for cheerleading or yearbook or any of these things because they don't want me there. So for this host of reasons, these kids don't often get those opportunities, and the schools need to think about how to make them part of the structure of schooling.
One of the great examples, and I'll just add to that, one of the great examples of making extracurricular activities curricular is related to one of our findings on children in the band. So the kids in the band that were scoring in Patricia is always talking about, you need to go back to the data because we need to explore some more of these activities. And children, the kids that were in the band tended to have higher scores, higher GPAs, I mean, even for the top quintile and the aggregate group of Latino students. So it's a really good example of how to make an extracurricular activity part of the curriculum. And we see that those programs in poorly resourced schools are the first to go. So the band programs, the music programs, the artistic programs are those first activities to go for underserved and poorly resourced schools and communities.
You want to ask your question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Wondering, what solution do you have for this? I mean, like, when you said about testing and stuff, I mean, you know what I mean? Did you have any,
The entire last chapter is about the solutions. The entire last chapter deals with what is it that we can and we must do.
Luis, you get the last word, I think.
Yeah.
Do you talk about continuation schools? And if you do, how do you analyze that right now?
No, the quick answer to that is no, and it's another important area that needs its own book to talk about continuation schools and the role that they can play. And we have a very high percentage of Latino kids who end up in continuation schools. They can be opportunities or they can be dead ends.
Doctoral dissertation topic.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the authors for